Okay, so we've looked at the positivistic approach. Now I'm going to have a look at the phenomenological approach. Now you notice the following. I might have chosen to use the word phenomenological, but I might equally have chosen to use the word qualitative. And in some context, I could use the word subjective, interpretive, humanistic. These are all synonymous. A synonym is a word that means exactly the same as another word. Now you'll notice that the phenomenological approach has 6 methodologies. 1, case study. 2, methodology is action research. 3 is participant excuse me. 3 is participant observation. 4 is participative inquiry. 5 is feminist perspective, and 6 is grounded theory. Now let's look at these in turn. Case study. If I wanted to study one group of people only, in one location only, that would meet the criteria for being considered a case study. So one group of people only, for example, I want to study female lecturers, young female lecturers in the business school at the University of Portsmouth. Because it's one group only, in one location only, it's called a group study, a case study. Now the second methodology is an interesting one. You'll notice there are 2 terms, action and research. So the methodology is called action research. It means that when a researcher is actually doing research, but at the same time he's improving. So for example, if you had a researcher who was interacting with the marketing department at the University of Portsmouth and seeing how they interact with overseas agents, if the research is ongoing, but as the researcher proceeds with his research, he notices areas that he might improve, then he would be using a methodology called action research, because he is both improving, let's hit that with an asterisk, the other asterisk, and research. Now, the third and fourth methodologies are sometimes combined. So major textbook authors would talk in terms of observation. I tend to separate observation into 2 different distinct categories, depending on whether you're observing externally, in which case I call it participant observation. But if the research is involving observing internally, then I tend to use the term participative inquiry. So for example, if you were a trained accountant working as an accountant and an observer in an external accountancy office, then I would use the term participant observation. If you were working internally in your own organization, then I would use the observation term as an inquiry, participative inquiry. Now you need to know that the term I preferentially use is participant observation, but participant observation is a sort of an observational methodology that's been used for a long time. In the early days, it tended to be used by anthropologists, and they preferentially would use the term ethnography. So I use the term participant observation as one of the phenomenological methodologies. Others might preferentially choose to use the word ethnography. They mean the same thing. Ethnography means participant observation. So now the 5th methodology is called Feminist Perspective, and there are some researchers who are interested in the role of women in the workplace. They are particularly interested to know how women impact on the workplace, and they are particularly interested to know how the workplace is impacting on women. So for example, we have in the UK, we have lots of men surgeons, so we don't have statistically as many female surgeons. So some researchers are really interested to know how the female surgeons are influencing events in the department, how the department is impacting on them. So if you're using a particular perspective that looks at how the female interacts with the environment, we call that a feminist perspective. So in actual fact, if you were doing work with female surgeons, then the approach would be phenomenological. The methodology would be feminist perspective, and the method would be focus group. And lastly, we have something called grounded theory. Imagine that I wanted to do research into the area of Instagram in business. Now, Instagram is a new relatively new social media app. I think it's owned by Facebook in America. But a lot of young businesses, startup businesses, use Instagram to develop their businesses. Now, if I'm interested in researching this area, I couldn't really go to a library and, take down some standard texts on marketing involving Instagram, because they're only probably being written now. I would have to interact with a startup company, interact with the managers, interact with the executives, interact with the business clientele. And I'd have to gather my own data sets, and I'd have to draw my own conclusions and my own discussions on my own theoretical base. So when you're doing research from the ground up, then we call it grounded theory is the methodology. Now, we've looked at both positivistic and phenomenological, and you might have an essay. An essay might be as follows. Write a brief essay comparing positivistic and phenomenological research. But remember, the word positivistic has other synonyms. It could be called quantitative. The word phenomenological has other synonyms. It could be called qualitative. So the exam question might be, write a brief essay comparing positivistic and phenomenological approach to research. But I might have equally described the question in the following terms. Write a brief essay comparing the quantitative and qualitative approaches to research. They would be exactly the same question, but they will be using different terms. So get used to all the synonyms. All right, so you'll notice that I've worked on this set here. You need to complete your own set here. I call that a worksheet. I love program learning. I studied in the States for a time, so I'm quite interested in the history of program learning. I think program learning is a very powerful pedagogical tool. So you need to complete your own version here in your own words. It can be Chinese or English. All right, so what I'm looking at now is I want to consider the positivistic approach and the phenomenological approach. And I'd like to think in terms of the advantages and the disadvantages. Okay, well, let's consider a physicist in a physics laboratory. He's using experimental studies as his methodology, all right? Now, if we were to examine his work, for example, we may have a physicist who's studying extensibility in springs, verifying Hooke's law. So I think you would agree with me that his work would be highly structured and it would be easily reproduced by another physicist, perfectly reproduced. So there are real advantages with the positivistic approach, but there are some disadvantages. If I were doing research into doing nuclear research, for example, or particle physics research, we have a major university research centre called CERN in Switzerland. And many of their positivistic research programs require thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of data sets. Some of the experiments can take several years to perform. That's a real challenge in terms of money, finance, hours, resource base, workforce, labour, involved professionals. It can be a real disadvantage in positivistic research that the data sets need to be extensive and very large. Now, by its very nature, positivistic research, we've already discovered, is rather structured, but the very essence of its structured characteristic, it means that it's going to be sometimes difficult to get below the surface and ask the question why about certain things. So we have a couple of advantages of positivistic research, a couple of disadvantages, and then we have a couple of advantages of phenomenological research, a couple of disadvantages. So let's consider the interview. I'm interviewing 3 lady surgeons. The approach is phenomenological. The methodology is feminist perspective, and the method is interview. Now, the advantages may be surprising. The first one is often very surprising. I can have a completely valid phenomenological research program by interviewing only 3 lady surgeons. It will be complete. Compare that with the tens of thousands of data readings that are required in some positivistic research programs. Now, the interaction with the ladies is going to be very rich in terms of personal experience. These are great advantages to the phenomenological approach, but there are some disadvantages. It's very subjective. I might interview 3 lady surgeons in Portsmouth in November 2021. I may have a colleague who interviews 3 lady surgeons in Southampton in December 2021. And you might find that my interpretations are very subjective and they are not repeated by my colleague in Southampton. So we can say that phenomenological research can be too subjective, and we can say it can be difficult to reproduce or replicate. Now you'll notice you have your own little worksheet to complete. So you need to complete this either in English or in Chinese. So for every sort of learning section I design, there's always a section for you to do during the lesson. So that's it's very structured interactive learning.